When the 24-year-old mechanic pulled back the trunk carpet of an abandoned car, he expected to find a spare tire. Instead, he found $8,000 in cash, a coded message, and evidence that would expose his boss as a Soviet spy running one of the Cold War's most successful espionage operations from a small repair shop in Virginia. On the morning of September 6, 1983, Danny Ferris arrived at Westlake Auto Repair 15 minutes before opening. He was 24 years old, a high school graduate who had spent 2 years at community college before dropping out to work full-time. The decision had disappointed his parents, but Danny liked working with his hands. There was something satisfying about diagnosing a problem, fixing it, and seeing a car drive away running smoothly. The shop sat on a quiet street in Alexandria, Virginia, tucked between a dry cleaner and a hardware store. It was a modest operation: 3 bays, a small waiting room with coffee that was always either too strong or too weak, and an office where Victor Kessler, the owner, handled paperwork and phone calls. Victor was in his mid-50s, a stocky man with thinning gray hair and the kind of accent that marked him as German even after 20 years in America. He had opened the shop in 1971 and built a steady clientele through honest work and fair prices. Danny had been working there for 2 years and found Victor to be demanding but fair, the kind of boss who expected quality but paid on time. That Tuesday started like any other. Danny clocked in, changed into his work coveralls, and checked the assignment board. Luis Hernandez, the other mechanic, was already under a Ford Escort dealing with a clutch problem. Danny's job for the day was listed in Victor's tight handwriting. Prep the Impala for auction. The car in question was a 1979 Chevrolet Impala, dark blue, sitting in the back corner of the lot. It had been there for 2 weeks, brought in by a customer named Robert Chen, who claimed the transmission was slipping. Victor had diagnosed the problem as minor, called the customer with an estimate, and never heard back. This happened occasionally. People brought cars in, got quoted a price they did not want to pay, and simply abandoned the vehicle. Virginia law allowed the shop to auction such cars after 30 days to recover storage fees. Danny grabbed the keys from the board and walked out to the lot. The morning air was already warm, promising another hot September day. The Impala sat beneath a tree, covered in a thin layer of pollen and dust. He unlocked the driver's door and slid behind the wheel. The interior smelled stale, like old cigarettes and vinyl baking in the sun. He turned the key. The engine caught immediately and ran smooth despite sitting idle for weeks. Whatever transmission problem Chen had complained about, Danny could not hear it. He pulled the car into Bay 3 and raised it on the lift. His job was straightforward: check the fluids, inspect the tires, note any damage or missing parts, take photographs for the auction listing. Standard procedure. Danny started with the exterior, walking around with a clipboard, noting a small dent in the rear quarter panel and some rust around the wheel wells. Then he moved to the interior, checking the upholstery, the dashboard, the trunk. That was where everything changed. Danny popped the trunk release and walked to the rear of the Impala. The trunk lid rose with a metallic groan, revealing a space that was surprisingly clean for a car that had been sitting abandoned. No jumper cables, no emergency kit, just the spare tire covered by the standard factory carpeting. He pressed down on the carpet to check the spare's inflation. That was when he noticed it. The carpeting did not sit flush. There was a slight gap along one edge, barely visible, and when he pressed harder, he felt something solid underneath that did not match the contours of the spare tire well. Danny knelt beside the bumper and pulled back the carpet. What he found made him pause. Someone had fabricated a false bottom in the trunk. The work was professional, not some amateur job done in a driveway. The metal had been cut, folded, and welded to create a hidden compartment about 4 inches deep, running the width of the trunk. The seams were clean. The paint matched perfectly. If Danny had not been checking carefully, he would have missed it entirely. He hesitated, then reached in and lifted the false panel. It came up easily, designed to be removed and replaced quickly. Inside the compartment lay 2 items. The first was a Samsonite briefcase, tan, with a combination lock securing the latches. The second was a manila envelope, unsealed, slightly thick. Danny looked around the shop. Luis was still under the escort, the radio playing softly. Victor was in his office, visible through the window, talking on the phone. Danny turned back to the trunk and picked up the envelope. Inside was cash. A lot of cash. He did a quick count and estimated around $8,000, all used bills in various denominations, 20s, 50s, hundreds. The bills were not sequential, not new, the kind of money that had changed hands many times. Beneath the cash was a single piece of paper, white, standard size, with a typed sequence of letters and numbers that made no immediate sense. It looked like some kind of code. Groups of 5 characters separated by dashes. No words, no explanation. Danny stared at the paper, his mind racing. This was not someone hiding money from an ex-wife or dodging taxes. This felt different. The hidden compartment was too well made. The briefcase was locked. The code was too deliberate. He carefully photographed the paper with his mind, memorizing the first few sequences. Then he placed everything back in the envelope and lowered the false panel into position. His hands were shaking slightly as he replaced the trunk. Carpet. He had been working on cars for 6 years, first as a teenager helping his uncle, then professionally. He had found strange things before. Drugs once, hidden in a door panel, a handgun under a seat. But this felt different. This felt organized. Danny closed the trunk and stood there for a moment trying to decide what to do. He could put the car back in the lot and pretend he had not found anything. He could tell Victor immediately. He could call the police. Instead, he walked to the office, the envelope and briefcase in his hands, and knocked on Victor's door. Victor looked up from his desk as Danny entered. The office was small, cluttered with parts, catalogs and invoices, a calendar from a tool supplier hanging crooked on the wall. Victor set down his coffee cup and gestured for Danny to sit. Danny placed the briefcase and envelope on the desk. He explained what he had found, describing the false bottom, the professional welding, the $8,000, and the coded paper. He spoke carefully, watching Victor's face for reaction. What struck Danny later, when he replayed the moment in his mind, was how calm Victor seemed. There was no surprise, no shock, no confusion. Victor simply nodded, picked up the envelope, and glanced inside without much interest. Danny had expected questions. Who was Robert Chen? Should we call the police? What kind of trouble are we in? Instead, Victor set the envelope down and looked at Danny with an expression that was almost bored. Victor said this was probably nothing serious. Someone hiding money from an ex-wife, maybe avoiding taxes, nothing illegal that concerned them. The car had been abandoned. Whatever drama was in the owner's life was not their problem. Their job was to prepare the vehicle for auction, nothing more. Danny started to respond, to point out that the compartment was too sophisticated, that the code suggested something beyond a domestic dispute. But Victor cut him off gently. He told Danny to forget about it. He would handle it personally. He would contact Robert Chen one more time, give him a chance to claim the vehicle and whatever was inside. If Chen did not respond, Victor would turn everything over to the police before the auction. Simple, clean, by the book. Then Victor opened his desk drawer and pulled out $200 in cash. He slid the bills across to Danny and called it a discretion bonus. He said Danny had done good work finding this, but now it was Victor's responsibility. Danny should focus on his other assignments and let Victor deal with the administrative headache. Danny took the money because refusing would have seemed strange. He thanked Victor and left the office, closing the door behind him. He stood in the garage for a moment, listening to the sound of Luis working, the radio playing a song he did not recognize. Something was wrong. Victor's reaction had been too smooth, too rehearsed. The discretion bonus felt less like appreciation and more like payment for silence. And the way Victor had barely looked at the coded paper, as if he already knew what it was, bothered Danny more than anything else. That night, lying in bed in the apartment he shared with his roommate, Kevin, Danny could not sleep. He kept seeing that code in his mind, the groups of letters and numbers. He had copied it down before showing Victor, writing it on a scrap of paper he now kept in his wallet. The paper felt heavy there, like a weight pressing against his chest. Danny stared at the ceiling and wondered what he had stumbled into. The next morning, Danny arrived at work determined to act normal. He clocked in, checked the assignment board, and spent the day rotating tires and changing oil. He did not mention the Impala. Victor did not bring it up. The car sat in the back lot, untouched, as if nothing had happened. But Danny was paying attention now in ways he had not before. Small details that he had previously ignored suddenly seemed significant. The way Victor handled certain vehicles differently. The phone calls he took behind closed doors, the customers who paid in cash and never came back. Over the next few weeks, Danny started noticing a pattern. About once every month or 6 weeks, a car would come in for what Victor called long-term storage or extensive repairs. These vehicles were always handled exclusively by Victor. He never assigned them to Danny or Luis. He worked on them himself, usually after hours or during lunch when the shop was quiet. The owners of these cars rarely called to check on progress. They rarely picked up on time. Some never picked up at all and, like the Impala, ended up being prepared for auction. Danny began documenting what he saw. He kept a small notebook in his toolbox, hidden under shop rags. He wrote down dates, makes and models, license plate numbers, names from the work orders. He told himself he was being paranoid, that he was seeing patterns where none existed. But the more he watched, the more convinced he became that something was happening. One afternoon in early October, Danny was in the break room when he overheard Victor on the phone in the office. The door was closed, but Victor's voice carried. He was not speaking English. The language sounded German, which made sense given Victor's background, but the tone was different from the casual way Victor usually spoke. This was clipped, formal, like a business transaction. Danny pressed his ear closer to the wall, but he could not make out specific words. The call lasted maybe 2 minutes. When it ended, Danny heard Victor moving around the office, then the sound of the safe being opened and closed. The safe. Danny had seen it once, mounted in the floor beneath Victor's desk. Victor kept the combination private. Danny had assumed it held cash receipts and important documents. Now he wondered what else might be inside. That evening, Danny sat in his apartment and spread his notes across the kitchen table. Kevin was working, late at the Pentagon, so Danny had the place to himself. He stared at the list of vehicles, the dates, the names, 12 cars over the past 6 months, all handled by Victor personally, all paid for in cash, none picked up on schedule. It could be innocent. It could be exactly what it appeared to be, a small repair shop with some forgetful customers. But, combined with the hidden compartment in the Impala, the $8,000, the coded paper, and Victor's strange reaction, Danny could not shake the feeling that he was looking at something bigger. something deliberate, something organized, something dangerous. The news that October was filled with Cold War tension. Korean Airlines Flight 007 had been shot down by Soviet fighters the previous month, killing all 269 people aboard. The incident had dominated headlines, ratcheting up hostilities between Washington and Moscow. President Reagan called it a massacre. The Soviets claimed the passenger jet was on a spy mission. Danny watched the coverage on the small television in his apartment, half listening while Kevin made dinner. His roommate worked as an analyst at the Pentagon, a low-level position that mostly involved data entry and filing reports. But Kevin had a security clearance, which meant he occasionally heard things that never made it to the evening news. Kevin mentioned that his office had recently received briefings about increased espionage activity. The FBI and counterintelligence agencies were on high alert. There had been arrests, quiet prosecutions that the public never heard about. The Year of the Spy, Kevin called it, though 1983 was not quite over. Danny asked what kinds of espionage the briefings covered. Kevin shrugged and said mostly the usual stuff. Dead drops, where one person left something in a hidden location and another person picked it up later. Brush passes, where two people exchanged items in public without appearing to interact. And front operations, legitimate businesses that served as cover for intelligence activities. The words hit Danny like cold water. Front operations, legitimate businesses. He thought about Westlake Auto Repair, a small shop, nothing flashy, exactly the kind of place that blended into the background. Cars came and went constantly. Cash transactions were normal. No one would think twice about a vehicle sitting in the lot for a few weeks. What if the shop was not really about fixing cars? What if it was about something else entirely? What if Victor was not just a mechanic, but something more? Danny asked Kevin how dead drops worked. Kevin explained that the beauty of a dead drop was that the two parties never met. One person would hide something, information or money or whatever, in an agreed-upon location. Later, someone else would retrieve it. If done correctly, surveillance could not connect the two people because they were never in the same place at the same time. A car could be a dead drop. Someone brings a vehicle to a shop, hides something inside, leaves it. Days or weeks later, a different person picks up the car and retrieves what was hidden. The shop owner facilitates without asking questions, gets paid to look the other way. Or maybe the shop owner was not just facilitating, maybe he was running the operation. Danny felt his stomach tighten. He thought about Victor. East German immigrant came to America in the early 1960s, right after the Berlin Wall went up. That timing suddenly seemed significant. The Cold War had been at its peak then. Both sides had been running intelligence operations, planting agents, building networks. 22 years was a long time. Long enough to establish credibility, build a business, become part of the community. Long enough that no one would suspect. Danny decided he needed more evidence before doing anything drastic. One more vehicle. If another car came in with hidden compartments or suspicious contents, then he would know for certain. Then he would act. On October 28th, a 1981 Datsun 510 pulled into the shop. The driver was a man in his 40s, wearing a suit that looked slightly rumpled, carrying a briefcase. He spoke with Victor in the office for several minutes, while Danny pretended to organize tools nearby. The man said his name was Michael Morrison. He explained that the transmission was slipping, that he needed it repaired, but was leaving town for business and would not be able to pick up the car for 2 weeks. He paid $600 in cash as a deposit, received a receipt, and left in a taxi that had been waiting at the curb. Danny watched through the bay window as the taxi pulled away. Something about the interaction felt staged. The man had not asked how long the repair would take or how much it would cost beyond the deposit. He had not seemed concerned about the inconvenience of being without a vehicle. He had simply dropped off the car and left. Victor assigned the Datsun to Bay 2 and told Danny to perform a diagnostic. Danny agreed, relieved that he would have access to the vehicle. He suspected Victor would reassign it to himself eventually, but for now, Danny had an opportunity. He started with the standard inspection, checking the transmission fluid, looking for leaks, testing the gears. The transmission felt fine. There was no slipping, no grinding, nothing wrong that Danny could detect. Either Morrison had been mistaken about the problem, or there was no problem at all. Danny moved to the interior. He checked under the seats, pulled up the floor mats, examined the door panels. Cars were full of hiding places if you knew where to look. He had learned this working on vehicles over the years, finding everything from spare keys to forgotten jewelry. Under the rear bench seat, he found it. The upholstery had been carefully removed and reattached with Velcro instead of the factory clips. Danny pulled the seat bottom up and saw a compartment carved into the foam padding. The work was amateur compared to the Impala's false trunk bottom, but effective. Inside the compartment were two items: a 35mm film canister, the kind used for microfilm, sealed with black tape, and a small notebook, maybe 3 inches by 5 inches, with a worn leather cover. Danny's heart was pounding. He looked toward the office. Victor was on the phone, his back to the window. Luis was in the bathroom. Danny was alone in Bay 2 with the Datsun. He opened the notebook. The pages were filled with handwriting in an alphabet he did not recognize. It looked like Russian, Cyrillic characters forming words he could not read. There were also numbers, dates, perhaps, and what might have been names or locations. Danny set the notebook down and picked up the film canister. He held it up to the light, but the black casing revealed nothing. Whatever was inside, someone had gone to trouble to protect it. He grabbed his personal camera from his toolbox, a cheap 35mm he sometimes used to document particularly difficult repairs. He photographed the notebook's pages, working quickly, trying to capture as much as possible. Danny had just finished photographing the last page when he heard footsteps approaching Bay 2. He shoved the notebook and film canister back into the compartment, replaced the seat, and stood up just as Victor appeared in the doorway. Victor asked how the diagnostic was going. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the bay, noting Danny's position near the rear seat. Danny explained that he was checking for loose connections, that the transmission seemed fine from initial inspection, that he would need more time for a thorough evaluation. Victor nodded slowly. Then he said he would take over the Datsun. He had some specialized tools that might help diagnose the issue. Danny should move on to the brake job waiting in Bay 3. It was not a request. Danny gathered his tools and moved to the other vehicle, but he watched from the corner of his eye as Victor worked alone on the Datsun. Victor did not use any specialized tools. He did not run any tests. He simply opened the rear door, pulled up the seat bottom, and removed the hidden items. The entire process took less than 30 seconds. Victor placed the notebook and film canister in a canvas tool bag, then walked to his office and closed the door. 20 minutes later, he emerged and told Danny the Datsun needed a part that would take a week to arrive. The car would stay in the shop until the part came in. Danny knew there was no part on order. The car was simply going to sit, occupying space, until someone came to pick it up. And when they did, whatever had been hidden inside would be gone, replaced by something else, or maybe nothing at all. That evening, Danny stopped at a drugstore on his way home and dropped off the roll of film for development. 1 hour processing. He sat in his car in the parking lot, waiting, trying to understand the magnitude of what he had discovered. The photographs came back clear. 12 pages of Cyrillic text, numbers, what looked like technical diagrams on the last few pages. Danny had no idea what any of it meant, but he knew it was significant. People did not hide notebooks in car seats unless the contents mattered. He drove home and found Kevin already there, watching television. Danny sat down and told his roommate everything. The Impala with $8,000 in coded paper, the pattern of vehicles coming and going, Victor's strange behavior, the Datsun with its hidden compartment containing what Danny believed was Russian writing and possibly microfilm. Kevin listened without interrupting. When Danny finished, his roommate was quiet for a long moment. Then Kevin said something that made everything real. He said Danny needed to call the FBI. Not the police, not local authorities, the FBI. Because if what Danny suspected was true, if Victor was running some kind of espionage operation, then this was a matter of national security. Kevin said he could not help officially because of his own clearance and position, but he could tell Danny this: the FBI took these things seriously. They would investigate, and they would protect Danny if he came forward. Danny asked what would happen to the shop, to his job. Kevin said he did not know, but the alternative was worse. If Danny was right and did nothing, then classified information was being passed to Soviet intelligence through an auto repair shop in Alexandria. People could die because of that. Americans could die. On the morning of November 18th, 1983, Danny Ferris walked into the FBI Washington field office carrying a manila folder containing everything he had documented over the past 2 months. His hands were sweating despite the cool autumn air, and his stomach felt like it was tied in knots. The lobby was busy with people coming and going, agents in suits, civilians checking in at the security desk. Danny approached the desk and said he needed to report a possible espionage operation. The words felt absurd coming out of his mouth. He was a mechanic, not a spy. But the security officer simply nodded and made a phone call. 15 minutes later, Danny was escorted to a conference room on the 4th floor. 2 agents entered shortly after. Special Agent Linda Reeves was in her early 40s, with short dark hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she did not waste time. Agent Tom Cordova was younger, maybe 30, taking notes on a legal pad. Danny started from the beginning. The Impala with its hidden compartment, the $8,000, the coded paper. Victor Kessler's strange reaction when shown the discovery. The pattern of vehicles that Danny had documented over months. The Datsun with Cyrillic writing and microfilm. He laid out his notes, the photographs of the notebook pages, his timeline of suspicious activity. Reeves and Cordova listened without interruption. When Danny finished, Reeves asked specific questions. How long had he worked for Victor? Had he ever seen Victor meet with unusual people? Were there any foreign nationals who frequented the shop? Had Danny noticed any surveillance? Anyone watching the business? Danny answered as best he could. He had worked there 2 years. Victor kept to himself mostly. The customers were typical, locals bringing in their cars. No one seemed to be watching, but Danny admitted he would not know what surveillance looked like. Cordova asked about Victor's background. Danny knew only the basics. Victor had immigrated from East Germany in the early 1960s, had opened the shop in 1971, had built a solid reputation in the community. He was quiet, professional, kept his personal life private. Reeves exchanged a glance with Cordova. She said something that made Danny's chest tighten. She said refugees from East Germany were sometimes sent back, not as refugees at all, but as intelligence operatives. Long-term penetration agents, they were called. People who would spend decades building cover, establishing themselves as ordinary citizens, all while waiting to be activated or running low-level support operations. She said the FBI would investigate Victor Kessler's background thoroughly. They would check his immigration records, his finances, his contacts. They would verify everything Danny had told them. But this would take time, weeks or possibly months. In the meantime, Danny needed to return to work and act normal. He should continue documenting anything suspicious, but not take unnecessary risks. If Victor suspected something was wrong, he might disappear or destroy evidence. The key was patience and careful observation. Cordova handed Danny a card with a phone number. He said this was a direct line to their office. If anything urgent happened, anything that suggested immediate danger, Danny should call immediately. Otherwise, they would contact him when they had more information. Danny left the FBI building feeling both relieved and terrified. The FBI background investigation into Victor Kessler began on November 21st, 1983. Special Agent Linda Reeves coordinated with the Bureau's Counterintelligence Division, pulling together resources from multiple departments. The investigation would need to be thorough but discreet, conducted without alerting the subject that he was under scrutiny. The first step was examining Kessler's immigration file. Records showed that Victor Kessler, born Klaus Victor Kessler, had crossed from East Berlin to West Berlin on August 27, 1961, just 2 weeks after the Berlin Wall construction began. He claimed political persecution, said his father had been arrested for criticizing the communist government, that he feared for his own safety. Kessler had been processed through the Allied refugee system and eventually resettled in the United States in 1964 under a program for German refugees. His file contained letters of recommendation from church groups, documentation of employment as an auto mechanic in West Germany, a clean background check. Nothing raised red flags at the time, but that was 22 years ago. Standards had been different. The volume of refugees had been overwhelming. Not everyone was vetted as carefully as they should have been, and both sides had known it. Soviet and East German intelligence had seeded operatives into refugee flows, sending trained agents west, disguised as fleeing civilians. The FBI dug deeper. Kessler had arrived in America with virtually nothing, yet within 7 years he had saved enough money to open his own business. The shop had been purchased outright, no mortgage, paid for with cash. Tax records showed the business generated modest income, barely enough to sustain operations and provide Kessler with a middle-class lifestyle. Yet Kessler owned his home outright. No mortgage, purchased in 1976 for $48,000 in cash. His bank accounts showed regular deposits matching his reported income, but financial analysts noted something unusual. Kessler had no debt, no credit cards, no car payments. He paid for everything in cash. His lifestyle was simple but comfortable, suggesting income sources beyond what the shop generated. Social connections were equally puzzling. Kessler had no extended family in the United States. He did not belong to any clubs or organizations. He did not socialize with other German immigrants. He attended no church. His life revolved entirely around the shop and his home. For someone who had supposedly fled persecution seeking freedom, he lived a remarkably isolated existence. The FBI interviewed Kessler's neighbors in a careful, roundabout way, claiming to be conducting routine background checks for a security clearance application. Neighbors described Kessler as quiet, polite, somewhat distant. He kept his lawn neat, waved when passing, but never engaged in extended conversations. No one had ever been inside his house. No one knew anything about his personal life. One neighbor mentioned seeing Kessler leave early in the morning once a month, always on a Sunday, always carrying a small bag. He would return in the evening. Where he went, nobody knew. When asked, Kessler had said something vague about visiting friends in Maryland, but he never provided details, never mentioned names. By January of 1984, the FBI had assembled a profile that raised serious concerns. Victor Kessler's background fit the pattern of a long-term sleeper agent. He had minimal traceable history, questionable finances, deliberately limited social connections, and now, thanks to Danny Ferris, evidence of involvement in suspicious activities involving hidden compartments and coded materials. On February 3, 1984, the FBI initiated physical surveillance of Victor Kessler and Westlake Auto Repair. A team of 4 agents rotated shifts, watching the shop from unmarked vehicles parked at various locations around the block. They photographed everyone who entered and left, documented vehicle license plates, tracked Kessler's movements outside of work hours. Installing Danny Ferris as an active informant required careful handling. Agent Reeves met with him at a diner in Arlington, far enough from Alexandria that no one from the shop would see them. She explained what the FBI needed. Danny should continue working normally, but pay attention to specific details. When unusual vehicles came in, he should note everything: license plates, physical descriptions of who dropped them off and picked them up, any conversations he overheard, any patterns in Victor's behavior. Reeves gave Danny a contact protocol. He would call a specific phone number once a week at an agreed-upon time to report observations. If something urgent happened, he could call any time, but casual contact should be avoided. No meetings in public, no visits to the FBI building, nothing that might create surveillance exposure. Danny asked if he was in danger. Reeves was honest. Probably not immediately, but espionage operations could turn violent if participants felt threatened. If Victor suspected Danny had talked to authorities, the situation could become unpredictable. Danny should be careful, trust his instincts, and call immediately if he felt unsafe. Over the next several weeks, the surveillance operation produced results. FBI photographers captured multiple vehicle exchanges matching the pattern Danny had described. Cars would arrive, be dropped off by one person, sit in the shop's lot for 1 to 2 weeks, then be picked up by someone different. The license plates were traced. Several came back registered to addresses that did not exist, addresses that were actually empty lots or commercial buildings. Others were registered to individuals who, when contacted, claimed they had never owned those vehicles. Their names and information had been used fraudulently to create fake registrations. One vehicle, a 1979 Oldsmobile Cutlass, was registered to a man named Brian Patterson, who worked as a contract administrator for the Department of Energy. Patterson had top-secret clearance and access to information about nuclear facility security protocols. When FBI agents interviewed him, Patterson became extremely nervous. He claimed the car belonged to a friend that he was just helping with registration paperwork. But his story did not hold up under questioning. Further investigation revealed Patterson had significant gambling debts. He owed nearly $30,000 to various bookmakers. His financial situation was desperate. The FBI suspected he was selling classified information to pay off his debts, using Westlake Auto Repair as a dead drop to pass materials without direct contact with handlers. By late March of 1984, the FBI counterintelligence team held a case conference to assess what they had learned. The evidence strongly suggested Victor Kessler was operating as a handler or facilitator for Soviet intelligence operations. He was running a dead-drop network, using his auto repair shop as cover. Multiple Americans with security clearances were likely passing classified information through this system. The question now was whether to arrest Kessler immediately or continue surveillance to identify the full extent of the network. Arresting him would stop the operation, but might leave other participants unidentified. Continuing surveillance risked further information compromise, but could potentially uncover the entire spy ring. The decision was made to continue watching and gathering evidence. On April 12, 1984, FBI surveillance teams photographed Victor Kessler meeting with a man at a Lebanese restaurant in Bethesda, Maryland. The meeting occurred at 2:30 in the afternoon, an odd time suggesting it was deliberately scheduled to avoid crowds. Kessler and the man sat in a booth near the back, spoke for approximately 40 minutes, and left separately. The FBI photographed the man through the restaurant window using telephoto lenses. His face was clear, distinctive. He was approximately 50 years old, heavy build, with thick glasses and receding gray hair. He carried himself with a confidence that suggested authority or importance. The photograph was run through multiple databases. The identification came back quickly and changed everything. The man was Yuri Volkov, a Soviet attaché assigned to the USSR Embassy in Washington. His official title was Cultural Affairs Liaison, but American intelligence had identified him years earlier as a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover. Volkov had been in the United States since 1981, ostensibly to promote cultural exchanges and educational programs. In reality, he was running intelligence operations. The photograph of Kessler meeting with Volkov was the breakthrough the FBI needed. It confirmed that Westlake Auto Repair was not just a front for smuggling or organized crime. It was a Soviet intelligence operation. Kessler was working directly with KGB handlers, facilitating the transfer of classified information from American sources to Soviet intelligence. Agent Reeves brought the photograph to her superiors and recommended escalating the investigation to a full counterintelligence operation. The FBI now faced a critical decision. They could arrest Kessler and Volkov immediately, shutting down the network and preventing further information compromise. Or they could continue surveillance, using the knowledge of the operation to identify every American passing information through the dead drop system. The decision was made to continue watching. Volkov had diplomatic immunity. Arresting him would accomplish nothing beyond creating an international incident. He would simply be declared persona non grata and sent back to Moscow. Better to leave him in place, monitor his activities, and focus on identifying and arresting the Americans who were betraying their country. Danny Ferris was informed of the development during his weekly phone contact with Agent Cordova. The confirmation that Victor was working with Soviet intelligence made everything real in a way it had not been before. Danny was not just reporting suspicious activity to the FBI. He was working inside an active espionage operation. Cordova told Danny that the investigation would continue for several more months. The FBI needed to identify everyone involved before making arrests. Danny should maintain his routine, continue documenting unusual vehicles, and above all, act normal around Victor. If Victor suspected anything was wrong, he might shut down the operation or warn his contacts, and the FBI would lose the opportunity to dismantle the entire network. Danny asked what would happen to the shop when arrests were made. Cordova said the business would likely be seized as evidence. Danny would be out of a job, but the FBI would ensure he was taken care of, would help him find other employment, would recognize his contribution to national security. That night, Danny sat in his apartment trying to process everything. For 2 years, he had worked alongside a Soviet intelligence asset, completely unaware. He had fixed cars, chatted during lunch breaks, celebrated when the shop had good months. All while, Victor had been running an espionage operation. Through May and June of 1984, the FBI surveillance operation intensified. Agents identified 3 Americans who were using Westlake Auto Repair as a dead drop to pass classified information to Soviet intelligence. Each was placed under discreet surveillance, their activities documented, evidence compiled for eventual prosecution. The first was Brian Patterson, the Department of Energy contract administrator with gambling debts. Surveillance revealed he was photographing security protocols and facility layouts at nuclear research sites. He would hide the film canisters in vehicles, drop the cars at Westlake, and days later, the materials would be retrieved by someone else, eventually making their way to Yuri Volkov and then to Moscow. The second suspect was identified as Michelle Cordero, a Spanish-to-English translator working at the State Department. Cordero had access to classified cables between American embassies in South America and Washington. The FBI discovered she was copying documents related to American policy toward leftist movements in Central America. Her motivation appeared ideological rather than financial. She had been active in socialist groups during college and maintained contacts with individuals sympathetic to Soviet interests. The third suspect was the most damaging. Robert Hastings, 32 years old, worked as a signals analyst for the National Security Agency at Fort Meade. His security clearance gave him access to intelligence related to American communications intercept capabilities. The FBI determined that Hastings had been passing technical specifications about satellite surveillance systems, information that could help the Soviets protect their communications from American monitoring. Each of these individuals followed a similar pattern. They would rent or borrow a vehicle, hide classified materials inside, drop the car at Westlake claiming mechanical problems, and walk away. Victor Kessler would retrieve the materials, usually within hours of the drop-off. Days or weeks later, someone else would pick up the vehicle, often someone with no apparent connection to the person who had dropped it off. The FBI documented dozens of these exchanges over the spring and early summer. Each time, surveillance teams photographed the participants, tracked their movements, gathered evidence. The goal was to build ironclad cases that would result in convictions, not just arrests. Danny continued working at the shop, maintaining his normal routine while living with the constant tension of knowing what was really happening around him. Victor never indicated suspicion. The shop operated as it always had. Cars came and went, repairs were made, customers paid and left satisfied. But Danny noticed small things that he had missed before. The way Victor would sometimes work alone on vehicles late in the evening, long after closing time. The phone calls that came at odd hours, calls Victor would take in his office with the door closed. The way certain customers, the ones dropping off the suspicious vehicles, never made eye contact, never engaged in casual conversation, seemed eager to leave as quickly as possible. By early July, the FBI decided they had gathered sufficient evidence. The risk of continued surveillance was becoming too great. If the Soviets discovered the operation had been compromised, they might shut everything down, warn their sources, destroy evidence. The decision was made to move forward with arrests. The date was set for July 19, 1984, a Thursday morning. The FBI would conduct simultaneous raids, arresting all suspects at once to prevent anyone from warning the others. At 6:15 on the morning of July 19, 1984, FBI teams executed coordinated raids across the Washington metropolitan area. Brian Patterson was arrested at his home in Fairfax. Michelle Cordero was taken into custody at her apartment in Georgetown. Robert Hastings was arrested as he arrived at his office at Fort Meade. At 6:30, multiple FBI vehicles converged on Westlake Auto Repair. Victor Kessler had just arrived and was unlocking the front door when agents surrounded him. Special Agent Linda Reeves identified herself, showed her credentials, and informed Kessler he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit espionage. Kessler said, "Nothing." He did not resist. He did not ask questions. He simply raised his hands and allowed himself to be handcuffed. His expression was calm, almost resigned. as if he had always known this moment would eventually come. Danny Ferris watched from across the street, sitting in his car as instructed by the FBI. He had been told to stay away from the shop that morning, to let the agents do their work. He watched as Victor was placed in the back of an unmarked vehicle, watched as more agents entered the building carrying evidence collection equipment. The search of Westlake Auto Repair lasted 6 hours. FBI technicians tore apart Victor's office, finding an elaborate concealment system built into the walls and floor. Behind a false panel in the office closet was a safe containing more than $200,000 in cash, various denominations, bundled and organized. Also in the safe were several cameras designed for photographing documents, encryption materials including one-time pads used for coded communications, and detailed records of vehicle drop-offs and pickups dating back 3 years. The evidence confirmed everything the FBI had suspected. Kessler had been running a sophisticated dead-drop network for Soviet intelligence. The operation had been active since at least 1981, possibly longer. Dozens of exchanges had occurred, meaning dozens of classified documents had been compromised and passed to Moscow. The most damaging discovery came from a notebook found in Kessler's desk. The notebook contained names, dates, and brief descriptions of information received. The entries were coded, but FBI cryptanalysts were able to decipher enough to understand the scope. The network had compromised information about nuclear facility security, diplomatic communications, and signals intelligence capabilities. The damage to national security was extensive. Victor Kessler was transferred to federal custody and held without bail. During initial questioning, he invoked his right to remain silent and requested an attorney. But investigators already had enough evidence for prosecution. The surveillance photographs, the materials found in his office, the testimony from Danny Ferris, and the pattern of suspicious vehicle exchanges provided overwhelming proof. Under interrogation, Kessler eventually admitted his real identity. He was not a refugee who had fled East Germany in 1961. He was Klaus Richter, an intelligence officer with the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, the Foreign Intelligence Agency of East Germany. He had been sent west as a long-term penetration agent, instructed to establish himself in America, build a cover identity, and wait to be activated. For 13 years, from 1964 to 1977, Richter had simply lived his cover. He worked as a mechanic, opened his shop, became part of the community. Then, in 1977, he was contacted by a KGB officer and told to prepare his shop for use as a dead-drop location. Since then, he had been facilitating the transfer of classified information from American sources to Soviet intelligence. The trials began in October of 1984 and extended into early 1985. All proceedings were classified, closed to the public due to the sensitive nature of the evidence. Media reports were carefully controlled, revealing only basic information about espionage arrests without disclosing operational details. Brian Patterson pleaded guilty in November. In exchange for cooperation and detailed testimony about how the dead-drop system worked, he received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. The prosecution established that Patterson had passed 37 separate documents to Soviet intelligence over 18 months, all related to nuclear facility security protocols. His gambling debts had made him vulnerable to recruitment, and the promise of cash payments had overcome whatever loyalty he once felt to his country. Michelle Cordero went to trial in December, claiming her actions were motivated by conscience rather than betrayal. Her defense argued she had been trying to expose what she believed were illegal American activities in Central America. The jury was not persuaded. She was convicted on 7 counts of espionage and sentenced to 20 years. The documents she had provided to the Soviets compromised ongoing intelligence operations and put American personnel at risk. Robert Hastings presented the most serious case. His access to signals intelligence had allowed him to provide the Soviets with detailed information about American satellite surveillance capabilities. The prosecution demonstrated that Hastings had passed 43 separate technical documents over 2 years. His motivation appeared to be financial. He had received payments totaling $85,000, money deposited into foreign bank accounts. He was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 25 years. Victor Kessler, identified now as Klaus Richter, faced the most extensive prosecution. The trial lasted 3 weeks. FBI agents testified about the surveillance operation. Danny Ferris testified about discovering the hidden compartment in the Impala, about documenting suspicious vehicle activity, about the Datsun with Cyrillic writing. Cryptanalysts testified about the coded materials found in Richter's office. Financial experts detailed the cash payments and unexplained income. Richter's defense attempted to argue that he was a legitimate refugee who had been coerced into cooperation by threats against family members still in East Germany. The prosecution demolished this claim by showing Richter had no family in East Germany. His personnel file from the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, obtained through intelligence sharing with West German authorities, confirmed he had been a trained intelligence officer, not a refugee. The jury convicted Richter on 19 counts of conspiracy to commit espionage. The judge sentenced him to 30 years in federal prison, calling the operation one of the most successful Soviet penetrations of the Cold War era. In the aftermath of the trials, the FBI conducted a damage assessment. The investigation determined that the Dead Drop Network had been operational since at least 1977, possibly longer. Conservative estimates suggested over 200 classified documents had been compromised. The information ranged from nuclear security protocols to diplomatic communications to technical specifications of intelligence collection systems. The true extent of the damage would never be fully known. The Soviets were not going to reveal what they had received or how they had used the information, but American intelligence officials knew the compromise had been significant. Operations had been exposed. Technical capabilities had been revealed. The advantage the United States held in certain areas of intelligence collection had been reduced. Danny Ferris received a commendation from the FBI in a private ceremony. Director William Webster personally thanked him for his vigilance and courage. Danny Ferris tried to return to normal life, but normal no longer existed. Westlake Auto Repair had been seized by the federal government as part of the criminal proceedings. The building sat empty for months before being sold at auction. Danny was out of a job, his reputation in the community complicated by association with the espionage case. Some people viewed him as a hero, the mechanic who had uncovered a Soviet spy operation. Others were less charitable, calling him a snitch, questioning why he had not noticed something wrong sooner, wondering if he had been involved himself. Danny tried to ignore the gossip, but it was difficult. Alexandria was a small community, and everyone knew everyone. The FBI helped him find work as a vehicle inspector for a federal contractor. The job paid better than the repair shop had, but Danny missed working with his hands, missed the satisfaction of fixing something broken and seeing it work again. The new job was more bureaucratic, more about paperwork and compliance than actual mechanical work. His friendship with Kevin survived, though things were different. Kevin had been promoted at the Pentagon after his role in encouraging Danny to come forward was quietly acknowledged. He moved to a larger apartment, started dating seriously. Their lives were diverging naturally, the way friendships sometimes do in your 20s. Danny struggled with the knowledge of what had happened. He had worked alongside Klaus Richter for 2 years, completely unaware. He thought about all the conversations they had shared, the lunches eaten together, the times Richter had helped him diagnose difficult problems. How much of that had been real? Had Richter seen Danny as a friend or just as cover, another element of his false identity? The classified nature of the trials meant Danny could not speak openly about what he had experienced. When people asked about the case, he provided vague answers and changed the subject. The story became local legend, details distorted through repetition until Danny barely recognized the events being described. Years passed. 1985 became 1986, then 1987. The Cold War continued, though tensions began to ease slightly as new Soviet leadership under Mikhail Gorbachev pursued reform policies. Danny followed the news but felt distant from it. His part in the great confrontation between superpowers had been accidental, a mechanic who happened to notice something wrong and had the courage to report it. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Danny watched the coverage on television, seeing jubilant crowds attacking the concrete barrier with hammers and pickaxes. He thought about Klaus Richter, sitting in federal prison, watching his entire world collapse. The country Richter had served, the ideology he had believed in, was disintegrating. The Soviet Union officially dissolved in December of 1991. The Cold War was over. The conflict that had defined Danny's entire life, from childhood memories of nuclear drills at school to his accidental role in exposing a spy network, had ended not with nuclear fire, but with economic collapse and peaceful revolutions. Danny had moved to Richmond by then, working as a vehicle inspector for the state government. He lived alone in a small apartment, occasionally dated but never seriously. The espionage case had changed him in ways he did not fully understand, made him cautious, suspicious of surfaces, aware that ordinary life could conceal extraordinary secrets. In June of 1991, Danny received a letter from the FBI. It arrived in an official envelope, his name and address typed formally on the front. He opened it carefully, unsure what to expect. The letter explained that new information had emerged from Soviet archives following the collapse of the USSR. As part of intelligence sharing agreements between the United States and the newly democratic Russia, certain KGB and GRU files had been made available to American authorities. Among these files were documents related to the Westlake Auto Repair operation. The FBI wanted Danny to know that the network he had helped expose was larger and more significant than originally understood. Klaus Richter's dead drop system had been operational for 14 years, from 1977 to 1991. During that time, the network had facilitated the transfer of over 300 classified documents from various American sources to Soviet intelligence. The documents had covered a wide range of classified information: nuclear weapons design specifications, satellite surveillance capabilities, diplomatic negotiation strategies, military communications protocols. The list went on for pages. More troubling was the revelation that Brian Patterson, Michelle Cordero, and Robert Hastings were not the only Americans using the dead drop. Soviet records indicated at least 7 other individuals had passed information through Westlake Auto Repair during various periods. Some had stopped before the FBI investigation began. Others had not been identified before the network was shut down. The FBI had investigated these leads, but several suspects had died in the years since. Others could not be definitively linked to the operation based on available evidence. The statute of limitations had expired for some potential charges. The post-Cold War political climate made aggressive prosecution of historical espionage cases complicated. The letter concluded by thanking Danny again for his service to national security. The FBI wanted him to understand that his decision to come forward in 1983, had disrupted one of the most successful GRU operations of the Cold War era. His vigilance and courage had prevented further compromise of classified information and led to the arrest and conviction of multiple spies. Danny set the letter down and sat quietly in his apartment. The evening sun came through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. He thought about that September day in 1983 when he had pulled back the carpet in the trunk of a 1979 Chevrolet Impala and found a hidden compartment. Such a small moment, such an ordinary action. He had simply been doing his job, checking a car for auction, being thorough in his inspection. But that moment had changed everything. He thought about the mechanics of espionage, how it operated through ordinary channels, hiding in plain sight. A repair shop was perfect cover. Cars came and went constantly. Cash transactions were normal. No one paid attention. It was brilliant in its simplicity, and it had taken an accidental discovery by a curious mechanic to expose it. Danny walked to his window and looked out at the Richmond street below. Cars passed in both directions. People walked dogs, carried groceries, lived their normal lives. How many other operations were hiding out there, concealed within the routines of everyday life? How many other Klaus Richters were operating legitimate businesses while serving foreign intelligence agencies? He would never know. That was the nature of espionage. Most of it remained hidden. Danny kept the FBI letter in a drawer, reading it occasionally when he needed reminding that what he had done mattered. The years continued to pass. He married in 1994, divorced in 1998. He changed jobs twice, moving from vehicle inspection to fleet management for a private company. He lived a quiet life, deliberately ordinary, avoiding anything that might bring attention or complexity. He never spoke publicly about the Westlake Auto Repair case. The few times journalists had tracked him down over the years, asking for interviews about his role in exposing a Soviet spy network, he had politely declined. It was not his story to tell in any public way. The details remained classified. The full truth would probably never be released. Sometimes, driving through Alexandria on business trips, he would pass the location where Westlake Auto Repair had stood. The building had been demolished in 1987 and replaced with a Jiffy Lube franchise. The new building looked nothing like the old repair shop. It was modern, corporate, brightly lit with large windows and colorful signage. Danny would slow down as he passed, looking at the spot where he had worked for 2 years, where he had unknowingly been part of an espionage operation, where his decision to open a broken video game cartridge, no, wrong story, where his decision to check under the carpet in a car trunk had set everything in motion. The past was buried there beneath fresh concrete and fluorescent lighting. No one pumping gas or waiting for an oil change knew what the location had once been. History had been paved over, replaced by commercial efficiency and corporate branding. Maybe that was appropriate. Maybe the best way to handle difficult history was to build something new on top of it and move forward. In 2006, Danny read in the newspaper that Klaus Richter had died in federal prison at the age of 77. The obituary was brief, mentioning his espionage conviction but providing few details. Danny felt nothing reading it. Richter had been an enemy, certainly, but also just a man doing a job he believed in, serving a country and ideology that no longer existed. There was something almost tragic about it, a life spent in service to a cause that ultimately failed. Danny himself was now 55 years old, his dark hair turning gray, his body showing the wear of decades of physical work. He had lived longer as the man who had exposed a spy network than as the innocent mechanic who had stumbled into one. The experience had shaped him, but not defined him. He was more than that one moment, more than that one decision. He thought about contingency and accident, how history turned on small moments that no one could predict or control. If the Impala's owner had picked up his car on time, if Danny had not been thorough in his inspection, if Victor had assigned that vehicle to Luis instead, the entire network might have continued operating for years. Hundreds more documents might have been compromised. More damage might have been done. But Danny had been thorough. He had noticed something wrong. He had reported it. And because of that, an espionage operation had been dismantled. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes doing the small right thing at the right moment was all that history required.